Dave Monk, the Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 in the FM dial, and we're in graduation stage. Lots of people around enjoying and doing and photographing. A couple of passings to deal with. Phyllis Hughes passed on. She was a very active person, lots of energy, and community person. Grew up with Detroit Russian Jewish background, 6 sisters and 1 brother, and she was eventually head of psychology at the Parkland College, a protagonist of Death and Dying, and understanding that sort of thing, and author of books related to that. Married to John Hughes for 40 years, musician. In retirement, she had a gallery in Lincoln Square. She had line drawings that she did as an artist. She was a dancer early on with Duncan, and a tennis activist, late table tennis activist. I call it ping pong sometimes, different name. And she was a gardener, and just all around interesting person, and also with her husband, John Hughes. And sad to lose her. Jerry Brighton passed on in February, but there's a memorial service to him on Saturday at May the 21st at the Wesley Methodist Church. And a lot of you know his children. We especially know Ann Robin, who is a medico, and Jack Bryden, who for a long time has been working at WIL and has gone elsewhere now. But the family is around, and Jerry was an accountant of note, a professor of accountancy with lots of PhDs to his student credits, and an activist with the YMCA and with the University Senate type administrations. He had a lot to do with human activities that include anti-redlining activities. He didn't like to see that people would not be able to buy or sell in areas where banks had set up for whole white or whole black communities. So we celebrate Jerry too, and okay. This week we had a student activist in the street. The Market Street is kind of an unusual street. It's an old street and it has interesting buildings, and I think that children from Bottonfield School were being encouraged to look at the architecture, figure out what might be substituted for what is already there, and looking at what is already there, and teachers willing to explain this area to rather young children, and we need more of that, and that was kind of nice. The Pocket Prairie is doing well. The wild ginger is in flower. The plants are growing fast, so that the young plants that come early in the spring and are not very high are being inundated, and they're going into their seeding regime. We have a little Pocket Prairie at near to the old railroad station. It's a thin, narrow strip about 2 feet wide, and somebody drove through it last Saturday and kind of shifted the woodwork that was around it. So it has been bulldozed and it's become a parking lot. And we were interested in that. We were reminded that there's a song associated with parking lots, and Joni Mitchell was involved, and David had a comment on her. Just for a moment, is the camera working?
Everything's cool, yes. Time permitting, we'll play you a version of Joni Mitchell's Little Yellow Taxi, which directly addresses the situation. Take something that's nice and real and organic, and you turn it into a parking lot. If possible, we'll have that for you at about past.
In the plants were removed to another location, so they're there, and if anyone is interested in some prairie plants at the moment, I have some. And I also have someone from Sydney who is interested in moving on some prairie plants. We don't always have an extra place to put them, especially at short notice. But those plants are not in the ground at the moment, but it's been raining, and so they're reasonably okay. I've been removing cup plants, which grow very tall, and invade the visual corridor of a billboard that's where we have Little Prairie on the Chestnut Street. So I weeded them out some. We've been to Monticello. This week I met with a new city administrator with his staff of community development, economic development, and recreation and physical plant. And the intent was to take our second pathway. The city has taken a perpetual easement with Heartland Pathways and put in an 8-foot trail across the Sangamon River, which finishes at County Farm Road. That has been a popular trail, and it is being extended from County Farm Road round to Old Route 47 at Green Apple Lane, where the new library will be. Well, we met and discussed that particular trail, and the attempt is to go to the Illinois Transportation Department with a request for an enhancement grant. And the enhancement grant would provide enough money to take the chip limestone trail of the moment, compacted chip lines, so you can ride a bicycle on, and replace it with concrete. The quid pro quo for Monticello would be the work and putting in of the concrete. The application would be to try and cover the cost of that, and we discussed the specific proposal, but we also discussed the fact that this is enhancement money where applicants are encouraged to have connections with other communities. In Monticello, it might be to Whiteheath and eventually to Champaign. It might be to Allerton Park and Cisco and Decatur. It might be to Clinton. And so the writing of this proposal is receiving a city approval, and we have to have a public hearing so people can get a chance to put their oar in the water. And we have to write letters of support, and the proposal has to go in fairly quickly. So that was new. The new director, Bob Maul, and I went out to the extension of the railroad bed, which goes from the west side of Monticello to County Farm Road to Green Apple Lane, and then we have 4 miles of quite good remnant prairie, and we would eventually like that to be a nature trail, probably a one-way nature trail. The prairie plants on that are absolutely wonderful. The hoary cocoon was there on stuff that had been somewhat devastated by grading, and I just took photographs there and was very, very pleased with the Wildcat Creek site. We have to remove a lot of Russian olives there, and that's a real pain. But they grow quickly and they're very, very invasive, so we have a lot of work to do there. We talked about farm invasion some, because if you have an invasion of corridors, then it affects the whole region, and so that was some part of the discussion. And Allerton Park has been putting shared roads in, so you have a sign of a bicycle on the road, and you need to be careful as you're driving around Allerton Park. We would like the same sort of shared road to go to Decatur. We've been writing notes about the Kickapoo Trail. I'm rather disappointed that it is 10 feet wide with 2 feet of gravel on either side of that, making it 14 feet wide. And this is something where we have to really get with engineers. There's a planning technique where you take what is really an A-grade ballast, which is a main line, and take it out and replace it with 10 inches of chipped limestone. And that seems to, in the first place, to be remarkably not necessary, because you have, for bicycles especially, and walkers, it's not as if you had a 100-ton rail car on it. This is good ballast. Why do we need to disturb it? And part of the problem is that over 30 years when this has been in debate and discussion and implementation, the prairie has grown up onto the railbed, and I'd see no reason why we shouldn't just move around a little plot of prairie that's come up and doing well. Why take it out after let it grow for 30 years? Seems to me amazing. There are some places where there's an adjacent road. The adjacent road could be used as a trail. This is problems because the planning has already been done. A lot of us were not asked for input into the planning process, so we find out about it when it's a fait accompli. There's been 25 feet by 4 miles taken out of Drummer and Flanagan soil for road widening. We're tending to lose prairie at a rapid rate, and I don't see that that's very necessary. So you may see me on Facebook with some sort of statement like this, but I was writing to the Forest Reserve and the Vermilion County Conservation District. In Vermilion County especially, there's a prairie between Bronson and Oakwood, which is really rather beautiful prairie, and it has grown up over the ballast, and I really hope that that doesn't have a 14-foot trail through it that's respectively ADA accessible, but I don't see why a normal nature trail couldn't be on the ballast without having to take out so much prairie. When we're down to 0.01%, then I don't see that that's necessary. And part of the problem is that the planners and engineers that are working on this are not necessarily biologists or sociologists or people who realize the value of the little bit of prairie that's there left. We've been into salvage. I took 4 regular chairs. I salvaged last week. I think I mentioned that I salvaged office type chairs. They're often thrown into the dumpster because there's no wheels that work on them. There's hair in the wheels and nobody knows how to remove the hair. You get a hacksaw blade and remove the hair. But anyway, the wheels were worn flat because they'd been treated as having no wheels. I put in replacement wheels, and the chairs, 2 chairs are quite usable and not necessary to throw them out and put them in the landfill. There were 4 other chairs which were more simple chairs, the sort of things you would buy for $5 each or $10 each, and they needed upholstery. So I got hold of Laurie, and she's a upholsterer, and we discussed it. The cost of getting the vinyl and putting on a replacement is it makes it impossible. So those chairs will go to metal salvage. Okay, now I want to say something about silkscreen printing because we do that. We have for years done high contrast silkscreen printing, and it's more or less suggesting that there's beauty and wonder in the prairie itself and the prairie history and architecture and landscaping around it. The technique is very well known, and so I'll just run through it. It's often very common in elementary schools. We don't necessarily are at that level. We're doing something a little bit more sophisticated and gallery level, but we also do rough and tough silkscreen printing. Let's remind you what it is. You take a stencil. If you put a hole in a piece of brown paper, and you take a piece of cardboard, you take some paint and you slide it across that hole and lift it up. You have a paper underneath. Hopefully you had to put in a piece of paper underneath, and you'll have a picture of that hole. That's a stencil. And when you get into little details like an E or an S, you find the stencils don't hold together very well. So one of the ways of doing better with that is to take a silk and put the paper on a silk so that it holds the blocking material together. And that's where you get to called silkscreen press. And you can put it on a frame. You can spread the silk across the frame, and then you can put the paper on the frame. That's rough and tough. If you're dealing with little kids, you can have a house here and a tree there and a mountain there and a prairie there. And it's by cutting little holes in the paper. And they have fun. You take a somewhat resilient piece of cardboard and you put it in their small hands, and they squeegee across. So the house can be red, the tree green, and the landscape whatever. And it's rather exciting to realize that you can do this several times over with several different colors, and you can come out with a little scene that is you can hand to a friend. You have to dry it, and then you have to frame it and present it. But it's kind of fun. Getting a little bit more sophisticated, we have a fairly formal frame. We have hinge it on one side of the frame. We can make blockage by using glue to block out areas that we like. So you can do it by hand, you can do it by photographically, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later. But the silk is perhaps 12 lines of silk per inch, or I think it's more than that, but it's not so tight that you can't get paint through it. You have to know that you're hoping to go around this little thread of silk, and you're left with a picture of the house or the tree or the mountain. So take away the brown paper and replace it with glue. Let it dry on the silk, and that can create a block. You can put in a bird or a moon or whatever you want, and when you're done, you can wash out the glue and have the frame again. Well, one of the reasons why having a silkscreen table is to have it at your level so that you can take the screen up and you can put in paper. You have little chocks that allow the paper to be where you want it to be, and then you put down the screen. You can have a vacuum cleaner that brings in that paper, makes it fairly firm to stay in one place, and you can have ink that should be fairly flexible, not too thick, not too thin, and you take a small amount of that ink or paint and move it across your image. When you've done with that, you lift up the screen. You can turn off the vacuum so that the paper can be pulled out, and you can dry it. If you want to do something more, if you have just finished a red house and you want a green tree, then you take a cleaner. If we're using oil-based inks, then we clean it up with kerosene or a solvent, and you can change the color to whatever you want. That's helpful. You can very roughly register, but the chocks are rather important if you want to register accurately and you want to have the house in this place, or if you want to put the house to have a doorknob or something, and it has to hit right where the doorknob is, then you're registering by using those little chocks. And the vacuum keeps the paper intact. Now you can do that photographically. You can block photographically by taking a photograph and enlarging it onto photosensitive film, and then you can destroy the pieces that are not exposed to light. So that means that you can have a screen that is photographically free for the silk to be available for printing. And photographic silk screening is quite useful. It's not been totally obsoleted by computerization, but it can be very, very various. We have a rough and tough one. If we have a road which is being invaded by mowing or something like that, and we don't want that, we can get out in the street and have a rough silkscreen and put it on corrugated vinyl and print. Prairie preservation. Grow it, don't mow it, or something like that. And people have fun seeing that image can be generated quickly, and it can be put on little political advertising frames and spread along the roadside to explain that we don't want this sort of area mown. We probably have, in order to do that, we have the backing of the Department of Transportation, people who are in charge of landscaping, but not always does the message move down to the mower. So we can do that quickly and inexpensively. So if you wanted to put silk screening onto a football, then you're going to have an unusual surface. So that football has to move as you bring the squeegee across and around so you have to have some sort of mechanism underneath. So a lot of printing on bottles and items is done with machinery that's commercially sophisticated. If you're doing T-shirts, you may have a capstan. You may have a frame where the T-shirt is spread and it's printed with 3 colors, perhaps. The first color goes on, and then you go a little further, and the next color's on, and so on. So it goes in a capstan. At some stage, there has to be some drying of the paint so that you don't have bleeding. It's sometimes ultraviolet light is used to in modern days to have an ink that is going to dry quickly, whereas we have often used older inks that dry very slowly. So silk screening has been a rather helpful thing to us. We are interested in what sort of silk screening. You can have a very high contrast silk screen where there's you close your eyes and you can see the landscape and you can see the trees in front, and then you can see the prairie right in front of you. So you can do multiple images. So the background might be in a soft tone, and then the medium art would be in a slightly stronger tone, and then the fence post in the front may be dark black and dramatic. You can generate that from your photographs, but these days you can use a computer to generate that sort of image. What you're trying to do is to bring to people a landscape that they don't often see, and that you interpret in a way a little bit, but then you're hoping that those people that see that image will come through with their own involvement, and they'll put their own interpretation. So that barn might be a barn that they grew up with in Missouri, or that they horsed around in with when they were young people. The animal might be high contrast enough that you can actually put your own imagination into it. So we've done that sort of thing. Sometimes you can be very accurate. If you want to take a photograph and overexpose it and underexpose it, you can eventually make the tree look almost photographic. So then you've lost some of your attempt to give people the opportunity to think about it and dream about it and be interested in it. We have about 30 images that we promulgate from time to time. We've not been too dramatic about it, but we encourage people to use the same technique. It might be you go into a cemetery and you look at the sculpted pieces, and so then you squint your eyes and figure out what tombstone is interesting and how does it relate to other tombstones. Is it an orb, or is it a handshaking farewell, a finger pointing to the sky, to heaven, a willow tree draped? So you have a chance to take a photograph and then convert it into something that other people will enjoy. I'm looking at my notes to see what I've missed here. Oh, there are the solutions that you use. We've, with our silkscreen huddle and pathways, and I should say this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
Dave on the board.
This is something what we do to promote prairies that are rather endangered. But the solvents that you use and the inks that we use are somewhat poisonous, and they're aromatic. They can cause a fire if you are on top of some sort of a heating or something like that with a pilot light. So we have to be very cautious about when and where we do this. The schools have changed that, and whereas we have a water-based blocking so that you can wash it out and reuse the screen, they have an oil-based blocking that is not so volatile, and they can wash it out with solvents, but they print with a water-based ink. And so that's good for high schools and colleges where this is often a useful technique. Even if you have that you can mess with your computer to make these sorts of images. There's something different about a silkscreen print that you don't exactly get with computerization. But using the appropriate solvents and washing materials is rather important. Okay, that gets me there. Oh, I should say that most of our images are of gallery quality, so we often get to present in galleries, and people have bought them to take back to Europe or to other places, and so we feel rather pleased about this. I should have mentioned when I was talking about Phyllis Hughes, she was also an artist, and she used to make line drawings, and she was a dancer, so she would often have line drawings that were of dancers. One that I have brought in is of a plant, and kind of interesting, but it is the sort of thing that she eventually sold as a part of a commercial gallery in Lincoln Square. And so likewise, we often go to shows with silkscreen prints. If we go to an open market, it's not so easy, because if you have a good quality gallery print and dust comes onto your print and you might slide one dusty picture across another, it makes a line across the image. And so you have to be fairly sure of yourself when you go to a sales. So we mostly go with frame material, where if there are aphids on the tree that leak little sugary material onto your screen, it doesn't hurt if you can wipe it off with a water or oil. So we don't always appear at farmers markets with these sorts of things, but interior in wintertime we do so, and that's very interesting and makes for conversation. I want to say also that when you do a silkscreen run, we do about 100 at a time. There's about 5 or 6 people involved. There's someone who run the press, and you have a foot press that lifts up the screen, and then somebody puts in paper and puts it against those chocks so that it's registered nicely. Then the screen goes down. Somebody has to make sure that the vacuum is pulling the paper down to make it firm so it doesn't move as you squeegee. And then when you're done with squeegeeing, you have to have someone to see that this silk screen doesn't leak around the corners or have a problem. And sometimes there's a blocking that is around your image has failed, and so it's quite a shouting period. You have a lot of fun doing this. It's it's a cooperative effort, and so then you have someone to remove the image and hang it on a linen line. So it can dry. We've been using inks that are not as professional as the more modern inks. The more modern inks dry quickly. And if you're doing T-shirts, and we were doing T-shirts and skirts and other things, so our slow drying was not the most efficient. These days, those T-shirts go into a tunnel, and the inks are oriented so that ultraviolet light will dry them almost immediately. They're a little bit more touchy-feely than ours, because our inks flow into the cotton of the T-shirt, and you don't notice them so much. Some of the more modern inks, you can feel them, not too bad, but you can pick up your T-shirt almost instantaneously after it is squeegeed. So we've had lots of fun trying to do silk screening, and then you have to have them signed. There's a signing law associated with artwork often, and if you sign, we do usually sign in pencil, because otherwise it would look like we were printing our signature. And you have people who select their silkscreen according to how the silkscreen has worn. If you squeegee 200 times, then the image is going to be a little softer than if you squeegee early in the stage, when the image is crisp. So there are people who will buy a silkscreen with an early number, and there are people who like to buy a silkscreen with a later number. And we sign in pencil because there's a law that says that if you violated the buyer, like you haven't signed it properly, then the buyer that's offended gets to be 3 times the price of what the silkscreen was worth as compensation for that. So there's a whole litany of rules about how you sign and document your silkscreen. It has to have a number. There are a bunch of people who like to buy artist's proof. So when we start, and you're not sure whether machinery is going to work well, then that's called an artist's proof. And sometimes it might have a leak on one corner, but it really is a good piece of art. And it's early in the run, so you can do that. And people buy artist's proof, AP, no number, but we put a number on each sheet of paper, and you buy according to the number. We also sometimes work with metal and have metal prints, and there again, its signature is interesting because if you're working with copper, for instance, the tools that you make to scratch the surface of the copper so that you can put a paper down, and it's usually moistened, and you put a roller across it, the paper moves into the little gaps that you have made, and that makes for a very crisp, interesting image. So now, once again, you have people who will buy the image that's neat and tidy and crisp, and then there are others who want to buy it when it's soft and worn out. So you've done 500 prints, it's worn. We don't usually do more than about 100. And we haven't done it for a while. We've been more concerned about preserving railroad beds and preserving prairie, but we have screens, and we would like to continue doing that. And often we end up teaching others how to do this. You do need some big tubs in order to wash out your screens, and you use sometimes chemicals to do that, but sometimes it's not all that invasive. It can be done effectively without people having to eat chemicals that they don't like, and so it's a very, very useful process, and the one that goes with steel printing or copper printing or vinyl printing, we have a big press, and it's like a Rolls Royce, and you can gradually wind a drum across this copper plate and pull off an image. And we have some of those images that have worked very, very well. Now, press requires three-phase electricity, and the three-phase electricity got into problems some years ago, and so we don't have that press at the moment. But we have the press, but we don't have it activated. We also do cards. Our prints are about 30 by 20, and they're just big enough that they don't disappear into the wire blue yonder. We make them just large enough to fit into a suitcase, but not be something you can roll up and put in your pocket. We do cards for that, so we take photographs of the silkscreen print and sell cards. And a lot depends on the quality of the paper that you put the image onto. If you have a textured paper, it's going to pick up the image in a slightly different way than if you have a very crisp, very formal, very smooth, almost plastic surface. Two different styles of art, and we can do that. Most of the images we have are of local scenes. We were lucky enough to have Wesley Quipo, who had a wheelchair situation where he would take our photographs and create a line drawing from them. And he had been a Hawaiian, and he dived into an ocean and broken his spine. So he could not really make a strong statement. He'd have to move his hand many times so it was pointillous, but he made very interesting pictures from our photographs. The only one that didn't sell very well was a drainage ditch, and we did that because drainage ditches are very much part of this landscape. So to see the water coming out of pipes into where there's a underground grid of drains, then that's part of the scenery. But it's not the sort of thing you want to send to your friend as a birthday gift or something like that. So we have some of those sorts of things where we've not quite picked the commercial picture, but it's more the landscape picture that you have around. Sometimes we're preparing these sorts of things for formal lectures. We help people to put together slide sets. We often like to add to a curriculum. We would prefer to have a small unit that would go into an existing curriculum rather than to have something that would be dominant and take over a curriculum. So the teacher, in effect, is the person who's in charge and who is the knowledgeable person. So our attempts to give slide settings and things like that to people is to give the teacher the ability to come into a program with her particular program or his particular program and include something that is helpful to him or her. So I was talking to the teachers of the children that were outside the other day, and that was my sort of thought. So we might have a teacher on hand at some stage to talk to us about how you use these sorts of materials, insert them into your curriculum program. Sometimes curricular are national curricula. There might be a physics program or a biology program or a climate program, and you need to find out how your particular situation would fit into that overall scenario. We have a lot of slides that haven't been developed. We hope that we'll have the opportunity to develop some of those and some of the storylines that are around them, and look to leave archives of these sorts of images. And what we do is also encourage you to do your images. Often I'll tell people just to take photographs of the thing that you find interesting. It might be an ant or a turtle or a butterfly or a flower. Just you're taking that. Even in film days, if you just took your photograph and threw the film away, there's something where you're looking through a lens or a microscope, you're seeing something different, and that is value in itself. These days, there's lots of pictures floating around, sometimes not deeply understood, but they're allowing people to do visual things they have never done before. So that's one reason why we are doing a visual thing, because we just like the inclusion of the visual corridor. How much do we have? 3 minutes. Okay, well, remember that Jerry Brighton will have a memorial service at the Wesley Methodist Church, 11 a.m. on Saturday, May the 21st.
We might also mention that we are about a week away from the groundbreaking for the Kickapoo Trail.
Yes, do you have the note over that?
I can just basically tell people that 1 week from today at, I believe, 3 in the afternoon,
yes,
over in Urbana,
check my
there's a
diary.
Tatman's, I don't know the exact name of it, but there's a Tatman's building over on the far east edge of Urbana.
It's near to Aldi's.
Right, and the name of the street, in fact, actually, there's a street over there named Tapman's or something like that.
Yes.
We'll have better details for you next week because we're planning to head over there for the groundbreaking. And
That's on Sunday afternoon.
right. So a week from today. Again, you've heard Dave talking about turning abandoned rail beds into trails for decades, literally decades now. Well, guess what? We're actually getting one. We're going to have 8 miles of a trail eventually. Maybe it'll take till at least this point, maybe even later, next year before this trail is actually completed. But there will be a trail that goes from Urbana to St. Joseph. And the groundbreaking to get the whole thing started will be 1 week from today, again, over on the east edge of Urbana. And we'll give you the details of times and places and things like that.
What's more, it'll eventually be 25 miles and go to Kickapoo State Park, which is an extra on the end of this trail.
Right. They are not starting it yet, but there is this is kind of like the Intercontinental Rail. We're starting from here going toward Danville. One of these days they're going to start from Danville toward Urbana, and eventually the two trails are going to meet, crossing over an amazing, how high is that bridge? High enough people could kill themselves if they jumped off of it, right?
Yes. So yes, it's at least 100 feet off the ground.
But and it always amuses me when Dave points out that detail, and I've just contributed it myself. But yes, so a week from today, you can, in the early afternoon, head over to the Tapman's Road, where there's a Tapman's building, and that's where the groundbreaking will take place. I imagine it's because in case of inclement weather, they want to be able to move inside into the Tapman's building.
Oh, it's the start of the trail also.
Exactly. The trail will be starting right over in that area.
So you have to figure out where to put visitor centers and things like that.
So what a great chance. I'm thinking maybe I will bicycle all the way over there. But yes, if the weather if the weather is the way it's been most of the days for the last week, maybe I will just hitch a ride with Dave to get over there. But what a great chance to have a nice little bike ride to get over and appreciate what's going to eventually be 8 miles that you can also bicycle if you've got fat tires on your bike to get over to St. Joseph. And so it's now noon, and I'm expecting the music. I've completely forgotten to start our closing music here in talking. So let's have a couple of seconds of Joel Mabus. If you've been listening for a while and you've wondered what it is we're always playing, this is from a two albums on one CD set called Flatpick and Clawhammer. This is from the portion called Clawhammer, and this song is a combination of two. It's called Old Mother Flanagan combined with Granny, Will Your Dog Bite? And with that, it is noon, and let's see. It would be nice if you remember what the date is today. Today is the 16th. Is that right? Something like that? 16th. So, and there you go. And the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and nobody else.